My great-great-grandparents, Patrick Connor and Bridget Curley, arrived in England from Roscommon between 1849 and 1850. Along with an extended family of 22 people, they lived in Simpson Street in Manchester, in an area known as Angel Meadow. Angel Meadow was a 30-acre site with a population of between 20 and 30,000 people, mainly Irish, and it was one of the worst slums in Manchester, described by Friedrich Engels as hell upon earth. On the 1851 census, Patrick was 49 years old and he was a labourer, but the rest of his family were hawkers. And I happen to know that they were fish hawkers because their daughter Anne was my great-grandmother and she was a fish hawker. That involved taking a cart to Smithfield Market early in the morning, filling it up with fish and bringing it back to Angel Meadow or another nearby Irish area and selling the fish from the cart. As the Connor children married, they tended to marry into other Irish families, so that in 1861, my great-grandmother Anne married John Degnan. The Degnans were from Mayo. John was a tanner in a tanner's yard, and Anne was still a fish hawker. They married at St. Joseph's Chapel in Marshall Street, which was also in Angel Meadow. 2 years after their marriage, they had a daughter, Mary, who died shortly after being born. On the 1871 census, the couple are living in Foundry Street, which is also in Angel Meadow, and John is still a tanner, and Anne is still a fish hawker. And they have one son, Jeremiah. They have two more sons, John and Henry. And Henry was my grandfather, born in 1874. On the 1881 census, John and Anne are living in Field and Yard in nearby Ancoats. John is still a tanner and Anne is still a fish hawker. They live next door but one to the Burke family, who are related to the Degnans. By 1891, Anne has died, although her parents, Patrick and Bridget, are still alive. The family has split up, and Henry and Jeremiah are lodging in Primrose Street in Ancoats, and they're working in a cotton mill. In 1894, Henry Degnan married my great-grandmother, Margaret Jane Larkin, at St. Michael's Church in Ancoats. Maggie, as she was known, was the daughter of Charles Larkin and Bridget Phillips, who were from Galway. Charles Larkin first appeared on the 1861 census as a 19-year-old living in Silk Street in Ancoats with his widowed mother and two sisters. And they were all working in a cotton mill. A few years later, Charles had moved to Widnes, where in 1867 he married Bridget Phillips. And on the marriage certificate, it says that he was a chemical labourer. In 1871, Charles and Bridget and their one-year-old daughter, Mary, lived in Pleasant Street, Widnes, and Charles is still a chemical labourer. By 1881, the family are back in Manchester, living in Prussia Street, Ancoats. Charles is a market porter. They have several more children, including my grandmother, Maggie. Sadly, their eldest child, Mary, died in 1885, and Bridget died in childbirth 2 years later, in 1887, at the age of 39, giving birth to their 9th child, who also died. In 1891, Charles is living in the same house with his remaining 4 children, and he's working as a general labourer. My grandmother, Maggie, who's 16, is working as a warehouse girl. 3 years later, in 1894, my grandmother married Henry Degnan at St. Michael's Church in Ancoats. And in 1901, Maggie is living in Silk Street, Ancoats, with her 3 children. Henry is away fighting in the Boer War. Their daughter Mary, my mother, was born 2 years later in 1903 in Poland Street, also in Ancoats. In 1911, Henry, Maggie and their 5 children are living in Poland Street, Ancoats, with their 5 children. Henry works as a scavenger for Manchester City Council. And in fact, I know from my mother that he was a dustbin man. In all, Maggie and Henry had 9 children, 4 of them dying as infants. Maggie died in 1947 and Henry died in 1950. Their daughter, my mother Mary, married Thomas Royal, who was English/Welsh. However, because of all the Irish intermarriages, my DNA today shows me as being 50% Irish. I'm very proud of my Irish ancestors. They arrived in England with just the clothes on their backs. They lived in the worst slums in the country and they were vilified by the local people. But they stuck together. They took out their carts and went to the market and got their fish and brought it back to Angel Meadow and sold it. And I'm very proud of them. And I think they must have been very intelligent people because their descendants today are teachers, architects, solicitors, and even a poet. So that's the story of my Irish ancestors. Thank you very much for listening.